In 1819, the United States found itself at a pivotal crossroads, maintaining a fragile equilibrium of 11 free states and 11 slave states. This balance, however, was not indicative of peace, but rather a temporary respite in the ongoing quest for territorial expansion. Although the term manifest destiny had yet to be established, it encapsulated the nation's ambition to extend its reach westward. At this time, the U.S. comprised states including Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama. Yet significant changes loomed on the horizon. In 1818, the Missouri Territory, part of the Louisiana Purchase, initiated its pursuit of statehood, while the District of Maine sought to break away from Massachusetts and join the Union. This situation presented a considerable challenge, as the potential admission of these two states threatened to upset the delicate balance between slave and free states, heralding a crucial moment in American history. On one side of the debate, Northern representatives and pro-abolitionists in Congress argued that admitting Missouri, which seemed poised to become a slave state, would facilitate the spread of slavery and obstruct their goals. In contrast, Southern representatives advocated for the inclusion of another slave state, asserting that each new state should have the right to determine its own status, akin to the original 13 colonies. Debates in both the House of Representatives and the Senate continued into 1819, at which point Maine entered the discussion. Henry Clay, then Speaker of the House, proposed that Missouri be accepted into the Union as a slave state, while Maine should be recognized as a free state. This proposal ignited further discussions, which continued into 1820, when the Senate revised the bill to specify that any territories located north of the 36-degree, 30-minute latitude line, established below Missouri's southern border, could only join the Union as free states. With an agreement finally established, the Missouri Compromise was enacted into law. This resulted in a reciprocal system of admitting one new slave state for every new free state, starting with Arkansas in 1836, followed by Michigan the next year, and Florida in 1845. Since Florida was designated as a slave state, it was anticipated that the subsequent territory to gain statehood would be a free state. However, this expectation became complicated when Texas made a strong appeal for immediate annexation by the United States. Texas had experienced a tumultuous history up to that point and was now on the brink of a significant transformation. After recently achieving independence from Mexico, having liberated itself from Spanish rule, Texas sought to join a different union, the United States of America. Initially, the U.S. government overlooked the Texans' request for annexation of the surrounding territory. However, as pressure from Britain increased for Texas to become an independent nation, combined with America's relentless ambition for expansion, viewpoints began to change. Ultimately, Texas was admitted to the Union on December 29, 1845. The central issue was Texas' desire to enter as a slave state, which posed a threat to the fragile balance that Northerners had worked hard to preserve. Furthermore, Texas claimed territories that conflicted with Mexico, its former ruler, and with its new status as part of the United States. These disputed claims became the responsibility of the U.S., a situation that Mexico found unacceptable. The newly inaugurated President James K. Polk, however, showed little regard for Mexico's objections. A firm proponent of manifest destiny, Polk aimed to secure the contested territories soon after assuming office. He sent American diplomat John Slidell to Mexico City with a proposal to purchase California, New Mexico, and other disputed regions for $30 million. The Mexican government, taken aback and firmly opposed to the offer, refused even to engage in discussions with Slidell, which enraged Polk. Undeterred by this diplomatic failure, he decided to instigate a conflict, believing that the United States would prevail. Thus, in the early months of 1846, Polk ordered American troops to the Texas border to provoke a reaction from the Mexicans, which ultimately succeeded. Within a few months, Mexican forces confronted American troops, providing Polk with the rationale he needed to declare war. As the Mexican-American War began, Debates persisted in the United States over the contentious question of whether Texas would be a slave state or a free state. With free states now in the minority, Northerners perceived that President Polk, a Southerner by origin, was pursuing territorial expansion to bolster the interests of slave states, thereby heightening tensions between the North and South. Nonetheless, the conflict progressed, with notable generals such as Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee showcasing their military prowess and building their reputations as American forces advanced toward Mexico City. The city was eventually captured, leading to the cessation of hostilities and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty required Mexico to cede not only the disputed territories of California, Arizona, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, but also the lands that now constitute Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Polk successfully met his goals and even exceeded them. However, the circumstances were anything but perfect. The acquisition of new territories led to increased conflicts domestically. In the following years, Iowa, Wisconsin, and California all pursued statehood, which ultimately resulted in the Compromise of 1850. This set of legislative actions aimed to resolve various issues with a primary focus on the status of slavery within the Union. In essence, it declared that California would enter the Union as a free state, while also requiring it to send one pro-slavery senator to the Senate to maintain the newly established balance. Moving forward, the determination of whether the territories acquired from Mexico would be slave or free states was to be decided by popular sovereignty. Initially, this strategy appeared effective, as demonstrated by Minnesota's admission in 1858 and Oregon's in 1859. However, it also sparked new tensions. In accordance with the principle of popular sovereignty, Senator Stephen Douglas suggested applying this concept to a newly organized Nebraska territory, which would effectively nullify the Missouri Compromise's boundary for slave states and split the Nebraska territory into two sections. Despite encountering obstacles in passing the legislation that would become known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, residents of both regions were allowed to vote on the legality of slavery. This led to an unexpected surge of settlers into Nebraska and Kansas, with individuals from both sides of the slavery debate arriving in significant numbers. This situation marked the beginning of a turbulent era known as Bleeding Kansas, which ultimately culminated in Kansas joining the Union as a free state in 1861. A surprising outcome given the circumstances. This was the final state to be admitted prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. What elements contributed to this escalation? How did such a nascent nation fall into internal strife so swiftly? The pronounced divide between the North and South can be traced back to their fundamentally contrasting cultural views on slavery. In the North, slavery was largely deemed unnecessary due to rapid industrialization, which diminished the reliance on manual labor. This environment enabled Northern citizens to critically assess the ethical ramifications of slavery, prompting many to question its validity. Influenced by European immigrants from nations that had already abolished the practice, these Northerners began to champion the cause of abolition. In contrast, the Southern economy was deeply dependent on slave labor for its agricultural operations, making Southerners acutely aware of the potential threats to their financial security and lifestyle posed by the abolition of slavery. This dependence complicated the ability of many in the South to consider the moral arguments against slavery, although some did support the institution. The invention of the cotton gin further solidified this reliance on slavery, deepening the rift between the two regions. The Southern states' heavy dependence on slavery raised significant concerns in the North regarding the possible expansion of slavery by the South. Conversely, Southerners feared that the North aimed to confiscate the slaves they already owned. Ironically, both sides presented valid arguments. The chasm between the North and South was substantial, rendering reconciliation nearly unattainable. Moreover, the contention between federal and state rights played a role in the conflict, although it is challenging to attribute the discord exclusively to this matter. The Confederacy, which arose later, developed an unexpectedly large bureaucratic framework, despite its stance against a robust federal government. Additionally, there were prior occurrences, such as the nullification crisis, where the South could have clashed with the North had state rights been the predominant issue. Nonetheless, it is clear that many individuals, especially in the South, held a stronger loyalty to their state than to the nation as a whole. This divide between state and federal authority likely fueled the growing tensions. Although it was secondary to the issue of slavery, the situation was further aggravated by a series of escalating incidents. For example, the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, strengthened the determination of abolitionists by placing the obligation to capture, return, and penalize escaped slaves and those who aided them on the federal government, even if they had reached free states. In reaction to this alarming development, politically active citizens in the northern states established the Republican Party as a response to the pro-slavery Democrats. This new political organization would soon become linked with the controversial figure of Abraham Lincoln, who had previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 before joining the Republicans and campaigning for the Senate a decade later. Although he lost the Senate election to Stephen Douglas, the series of speeches and debates leading up to the election significantly enhanced his popularity in the North, while simultaneously creating numerous opponents in the South. His very presence as a political figure escalated tensions and sparked controversy, reminiscent of the events in Bleeding Kansas. The period from 1855 to 1859 is frequently described as one marked by guerrilla warfare. During this time, Nebraska saw an influx of settlers both supporting and opposing slavery, all aiming to sway the forthcoming vote. However, it was Kansas that bore the brunt of the turmoil. Pro-slavery advocates from neighboring states took advantage of legal loopholes to enter Kansas and engage in its territorial elections, which led to a fragmented government and widespread violence. Historians estimate that between 50 and 200 individuals lost their lives during these 4 years, akin to pouring gasoline on a burgeoning fire, bringing the nation closer to civil war. Charles Sumner's speech in Congress regarding Kansas further intensified the situation. A Northern Republican, Sumner had thoroughly memorized his passionate address titled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he denounced slavery and directly criticized pro-slavery senators. This incident highlighted the escalating tensions within both the Union and Congress. In response to Sumner's harsh criticisms, South Carolina Representatives Preston Brooks and Lawrence Keitt physically assaulted him with a cane, causing injuries that required a 3-year recovery. This altercation occurred just a year before one of the most controversial and provocative events leading to the Civil War, the Dred Scott case, which would hasten the path toward military conflict between the North and South. The case revolved around Dred Scott, a man who had been enslaved since birth. After the death of his first owner in 1832, Scott was purchased by John Emerson. Following Emerson's death, ownership of Scott and his family passed to Emerson's wife, Irene. Throughout their time together, Scott and his family traveled through various free states and territories, yet they never attempted to escape or seek their freedom. Instead, after Irene became their owner, Scott sought to negotiate for their emancipation. One statute stipulated that any enslaved person brought to a free state would automatically be granted freedom and could not be returned to slavery, regardless of whether they left that state. Another statute allowed individuals to file claims for wrongful enslavement. The Scotts received assistance from abolitionists, fellow church members, and ironically from the family of their previous owner, which enabled them to pursue their case in court. Initially, their case was dismissed in 1847 due to a procedural issue, but they were later granted a retrial. The new trial occurred in January 1850, resulting in a favorable outcome for the Scotts and their liberation. However, Irene quickly appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court. 2 years later, the court ruled in favor of Irene, effectively re-enslaving the Scott family. Undeterred, Scott initiated a federal lawsuit in the United States Circuit Court for the District of Missouri the following year. Before the case could be resolved, Irene transferred the Scotts to her brother, John Sanford, prompting the case to be renamed Dred Scott versus Sanford. In the spring of 1854, the federal court ruled in favor of Sanford, leading Scott to appeal once more to the United States Supreme Court. The final trial began on February 11, 1856, drawing an increasing number of abolitionists and political supporters for the Scotts. However, within a month, a ruling was issued, resulting in yet another setback for Dred Scott. Notably, the judge who delivered the final decision stated that no African American could assert rights in federal court, as they were considered incapable of being citizens of the United States. Although the Scotts would eventually achieve their freedom through the efforts of Irene's new abolitionist husband and support from their former owner's family, the case became a significant moment for many abolitionists. John Brown became one of the most infamous abolitionists in American history, and on October 16, 1859, he would exemplify the reasons for this infamy. He signaled a watchman as he and a group of fellow abolitionists launched an ambitious, though ultimately futile, raid on Harper's Ferry. After taking several hostages and seizing control of the U.S. Armory and Arsenal, the raiders encountered delays caused by a local militia, while General Robert E. Lee moved into the town to address the crisis. Brown and his followers intended to provoke a local slave rebellion. However, many of the raiders were killed upon Lee's arrival, and Brown himself was captured and later executed for treason against the state of Virginia. Despite the failure of his mission and the loss of his life, Brown's profound hatred for the South resonated with many, making it impossible to alter the prevailing attitudes of the time. Following the election of the anti-slavery Northerner Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860, tensions escalated dramatically. In the wake of Lincoln's election, the South Carolina General Assembly convened to deliberate on secession. To the satisfaction of the local populace, South Carolina voted unanimously to withdraw from the United States. Shortly thereafter, a document was issued that justified their decision to secede, marking a significant moment in this process. A geographical divide had indeed emerged across the Union. Subsequently, 10 more Southern states would follow suit and join the newly established Confederate States of America, led by their elected president, Jefferson Davis. President Abraham Lincoln of the Union refused to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government, insisting that he had no intention of taking anyone's slaves and was solely focused on preserving the Union. This position was of little importance to the Southerners, who were rapidly striving to create a cohesive nation from a group of states that had previously prioritized their independence. Furthermore, the South encountered considerable disadvantages as the looming conflict approached. Although exact numbers are debated, it is estimated that at the time of the widespread secession that led to the formation of the Confederacy, the Union's population was around 22 million, in contrast to the South's estimated 9 million. In the end, the Union would recruit approximately 2 million soldiers, while the Confederacy could only gather about 900,000. Additionally, the North had nearly 20,000 miles of railroad, which was twice the length available to the Confederate States, granting the Union a significant logistical edge for the movement of troops and supplies during the war. While it is often claimed that Confederate generals such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Patrick Cleburne provided the South with a tactical advantage over their northern counterparts, the North maintained superiority in other vital areas, including the production of roughly 90% of goods in the former United States at that time. Nonetheless, the Union was gradually losing its grip on the South, holding only limited territories within the Confederate States, and on the brink of losing more. Fort Sumter stood as the last Union stronghold in South Carolina. Though the term stronghold is used loosely, the fort was significantly outnumbered and lacked sufficient supplies. As Southern forces intensified their efforts to capture Union property within their territory, Fort Sumter became surrounded. The Confederates aimed to force the dwindling Union forces stationed there to surrender. However, the Union troops refused to capitulate, leading the Confederates to initiate hostilities. Thus, the Civil War began.